Throughout the previous lecture videos, we've actually started talking about comma usage, particularly when we're combining sentences, whether through coordination or subordination or attaching phrases to sentences with a comma. And we will return and summarize all of that comma usage that we've discussed implicitly in a later video. But I want to begin now introducing other uses for commas when you're adding phrases in the middle of a sentence, not just to the beginning or to the end, but to the middle. Now, when you're adding these phrases and clauses to the middle of a sentence, whether it's a participial phrase, which we've talked about previously, or it's a relative clause or an appositive phrase, which we've referenced previously, but we'll go into more detail about in the next couple of videos. When they're in the middle of the sentence, there's a very important rule of thumb, very important heuristic that you can use to know how to punctuate it. And that's that either you're going to use 2 commas or none. And I call this the 2 or none rule. You're going to use 2 commas or none. And whether you use 2 commas or none depends on whether the clause or the phrase is essential or non-essential. Sometimes you'll see this as restrictive or non-restrictive, but I'm going to use essential and non-essential because it's more obvious what that means. So, well, what do we mean by essential or non-essential? If a phrase or clause is essential in a sentence, it means it cannot be left out without some ambiguity or loss of critical meaning to the sentence. Where if it's non-essential, it could be omitted without losing the central meaning of the sentence because it's essentially extra information that isn't essential to understanding the sentence. So let's look at an example. The man flying over Metropolis used his X-ray vision to find the bank robbers versus the man flying over Metropolis uses X-ray vision to find the bank robbers. So here we've got commas, here we do not. What is the difference? In this case, this phrase flying over Metropolis is non-essential. In the way the sentence has been written, it is not critical to understanding the sentence or who you're referring to know that the man is flying over Metropolis, right? It's just there's this man you're talking about who just so happens to be flying over Metropolis at the time, extra information, who's using his X-ray vision. Fine. Whereas in this case, where there aren't commas, this is when you have an essential phrase. Because here, the man flying over Metropolis, we want to specify the exact man we're talking about here, right? It's the man flying over Metropolis, that one who uses X-ray vision, not the one burrowing underground, not the one rocketing off into space. It's the man flying over Metropolis who uses X-ray vision. Now, on the test, most of the time, you're not really going to have to choose between 2 or none. You just got to know that 2 or none is the move you want to make. And in these examples here, in both of these, we have just 1 comma setting off the phrase, and this is never right when it's in the middle of the sentence. The man, comma, flying over Metropolis uses X-ray vision, or the man flying over Metropolis, comma, uses X-ray vision. Not good, cannot work. So this is the 2 or none rule. When you have these phrases in the middle of the sentence, they're non-essential or they're essential, you use 2 or no commas. And we'll talk more about if you have to choose between 2 or none, how you make that decision. But right now we're just focusing on that 2 or none. Let's look at some more examples. My brother who is in the army came home yesterday. My brother who is in the army came home yesterday. So here we have an essential phrase, and here it's non-essential. And in a little bit, we'll talk about the difference between these. But note, when it's essential, there's no commas. When it's not essential, there are commas. This is an example of relative clauses being used in this way. How about this? He who must not be named is a bad dude, or he who must not be named is a bad dude. Again, this is essential. This is non-essential. And therefore it is reflected in the way it's punctuated and in fact how it's capitalized, though this is kind of specific to this kind of sentence. All that matters for us is that we use no commas or no commas, 2 or none in these cases. Again, kind of a relative clause. Former CEO Bill Stockton will meet with the board to discuss options for leadership change. A former CEO, Bill Stockton, once praised the board for its wise decisions. So 2 kind of different sentences, but basically doing the same thing here. Former CEO Bill Stockton is essential. We don't need to use commas. Here, Bill Stockton is non-essential. We do use commas. These are examples of a positive phrasage, which we'll go into more detail about in a couple of videos from now. But here's another example of that, a positive phrase. Skeletal fluorosis, comma, a disease caused by the accumulation of fluoride in bones can lead to joint pain, stiffness of joints, and increased risk of fractures. Keep track of our commas here. Here are the two commas that separate this phrase off from the rest of the sentence. The rest of the commas here are used to separate members of a list in the normal way we've seen before. But here the two commas we're focused on are the ones separating this a positive phrase, which is defining what skeletal fluorosis is from the rest of the sentence. So, as I've said before, in most SAT writing questions, you're not going to have to choose between a to or a none choice. Really, it's going to be about eliminating the choices that have only one comma or that make some other error, and that's often enough to get you down to at least two, if not the answer. Now, there are some circumstances, however, where you have to choose between a choice with two commas and a choice with none. And in those cases, you ask yourself this question, or these following questions. Is this information essential or non-essential to the sentence? Or if I remove the words between the commas, you can ask, does the sentence still make sense? Now, if that information seems to be essential, or if the sentence doesn't make sense if you remove it, then you want to use no commas. If it's non-essential or the sentence does make sense, removing it, then you use two commas. And to illustrate, let's go back to these examples up here to show you the difference between these two. The differences we're going to talk about here are very subtle on the real test, as we'll see examples of. They're much less subtle than the ones we're looking at here, but I think these illustrate the rules pretty clearly once we get into them. So let's look at these two. The only difference is one is commaed off, one is not. One is non-essential, the other is essential. So what's the difference here? My brother, who is in the Army, came home yesterday. If this is essential, it means we have to specify which brother came home yesterday, meaning this speaker probably, let's pretend, has three brothers. So they have to specify my brother who is in the Army, that brother, the one in the Army, came home yesterday. So removing this from the sentence would introduce some ambiguity. Like if I have three brothers and I walk up to you and say, oh, my brother came home yesterday, you would naturally ask, which brother, right? So in this case, if I then say my brother who is in the Army came home yesterday, now it's very clear which brother I'm talking about, which is why in this case it's essential. Let's imagine though I had only one brother. If I only have one brother and I walk up to you and say, oh, my brother came home yesterday, I don't have to specify that he's in the Army. So if I did say my brother who is in the Army, this is basically extra information that isn't essential to understanding what's going on here, right? You could eliminate this from the sentence and you could say my brother came home yesterday, and if you only have one brother, there's no problem with it. Whereas here, assuming you have more than one brother, eliminating this wouldn't make any sense because we wouldn't know which brother you're talking about. So what you have to look at in these cases is the context. Does it make sense to have this or not based on the information that's already been presented and how specific you have to get with your examples? Same thing here. He who must not be named is a bad dude. This is so essential to the meaning of the sentence that it's capitalized, right? This is from Harry Potter basically, but in any event, it's so essential. Not only does it not have commas, it's actually incorporated into the name. That's not something you're going to see, but it just illustrates how essential this clause is, this relative clause is to the sentence. Whereas here, he, who must not be named, is a bad dude. This is extra information that if we got rid of it and just said he is a bad dude, not having this information, it's fine. Like we have no issues with meaning. It makes sense. How about these two? Former CEO Bill Stockton will meet with the board to discuss options. So you could have done former CEO, Bill Stockton, but here it's important to specify which former CEO we're talking about. We're talking about former CEO Bill Stockton. It's almost like this is his title. We don't want to separate his title from the sentence. Here, if you removed Bill Stockton from the sentence, you would get a sentence that doesn't make sense at all. Former CEO will meet with the board to discuss options. That doesn't make sense. It should be former CEO Bill Stockton, and therefore it's essential. Therefore, we need to have no commas. In this one, a former CEO, Bill Stockton, once praised the board for its wise decisions. Here, we don't really care explicitly that it's Bill Stockton. We just care that it's a former CEO who happens to be Bill Stockton, but it's not essential, right? We could say a former CEO once praised the board. Sure, it's nice to know which CEO it is, but it's not essential. So here we do need commas. Now in this one, we need commas because this definition is not really essential. I mean, if you know what skeletal fluorosis is, you don't need the definition. It's nice to have, but you don't need to have no commas here because it's just kind of extra supplementary information. And in fact, when you have definitions like this, long appositive phrases in particular, typically you're always going to use commas because it's going to be extra info. So those are your rules for reviewing. We will see examples of this coming up in a little bit and in practice questions. So when we get into the examples, you'll see exactly how this works.